"Mom, you don't need that money anyway. You're just going to waste it sitting in that house doing nothing." That was what my own daughter said to me the day she emptied my pension account. Every single dollar I had saved for 32 years, gone in one afternoon. While I stood in my kitchen holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, I smiled at her, nodded, and said nothing, because I had already decided what I was going to do. And when she came back from that vacation and opened my refrigerator, she screamed so loud the neighbors called to check if I was still alive. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I am 67 years old. I have 2 bad knees, 1 good eye, a garden full of roses that bloom every April without fail, and apparently, according to my daughter Diane, absolutely no sense of how to manage my own life. I was not always this way. I was not always the kind of woman who sits quietly with a cold cup of coffee while her child explains to her, in the patient and slightly condescending tone you might use with a golden retriever, that her life savings are being repurposed for a luxury cruise through the Caribbean. I used to be sharper, faster, the kind of woman who could balance a checkbook, raise 2 children, hold down a full-time job as an office manager for a medical practice, and still have dinner on the table by 6:30. I did all of that while my husband Robert worked double shifts at the refinery and came home smelling like oil and exhaustion. Robert died 9 years ago. Heart attack. Sitting in his recliner watching the evening news. One minute he was there, the next he was gone. And the world just kept spinning like nothing had happened at all. I buried him on a Tuesday, and by Friday, I was figuring out how to live alone for the first time in 41 years. The pension was mine, every penny of it. I had worked at that medical practice for 26 years before Dr. Hensley retired and the whole office closed down. I had contributed faithfully to the pension plan the entire time, and after Robert passed, I added my survivor benefits on top of that. It was not a fortune, but it was mine. It was security. It was the thing that let me sleep at night without listening to the silence in the house and feeling like the walls were closing in. Diane knew about the pension. My son Kevin knew too. I had always been transparent with both of them because I thought, foolishly it turns out, that being open with your children about your finances was the responsible thing to do. I thought it would prevent arguments. I thought it would build trust. What it actually did was hand my daughter a roadmap to everything I had. Diane is 41. She is the older of my 2 children, and she was always the dramatic one, even as a small girl. She used to stage elaborate plays in the living room, using her stuffed animals as the cast, and herself as the star, the director, and the only member of the audience who ever truly appreciated her work. She grew up beautiful, which I say not out of vanity, but because it matters to the story. She learned early that her looks opened doors and that her tears closed arguments. She married a man named Bryce when she was 28. Bryce is the kind of man who has strong opinions about wine and very little else to recommend him. He works in some kind of sales position that he describes differently every time someone asks, and he spends money like it is a competitive sport. They have a daughter, my granddaughter Lily, who is 13 and the only genuinely good thing to come out of that marriage as far as I can tell. For the first few years after Robert died, Diane was attentive. She called regularly. She came to visit on holidays and sometimes in between. She brought casseroles. She sat with me and let me cry. I thought we had gotten closer. I thought grief had softened something between us. What I did not understand then was that Diane had also been watching, quietly cataloging, taking note of the pension statements I left on the kitchen counter, the investment accounts Robert had set up, the small but comfortable life I had built in the house we had owned free and clear for 15 years. The first sign of trouble came about 2 years after Robert died. Diane called to tell me that she and Bryce were having some financial difficulties. Nothing serious, she said, just a temporary cash flow issue. She asked if I could help. I said, of course. I gave her $5,000. I did not ask questions. I did not set terms. I gave it freely because she was my daughter and her stress was my stress, and that is what mothers do. The second time she asked, about 8 months later, I gave her $3,000. The third time, I gave $2,000. By the fourth request, I was starting to feel a small but persistent knot forming somewhere between my ribcage and my stomach. But I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that family helped family. I told myself that Robert would have done the same. What I should have been telling myself was to pay closer attention. The trip idea started the previous winter. Diane called one evening in December, and she sounded bright and excited in a way that immediately made the knot in my stomach return. She had been talking to a travel agent, she said. She and Bryce and Lily were thinking about taking a real vacation, not just a long weekend somewhere, a proper trip, a Caribbean cruise, 12 days, first-class cabins, the works. She had been so stressed, she said. Bryce had been so stressed. Lily deserved something special before high school started. They all needed this. I listened. I made the appropriate sounds. I asked about dates and costs. The cost, she mentioned almost as an aside, almost like it was a small and inconsequential thing, was going to be somewhere in the range of $14,000 for the three of them. First class, she repeated, like the repetition was meant to justify the number. I said that sounded very expensive. I said I hoped they could find a good deal. I did not volunteer anything more than that. There was a pause on the phone, one of those pauses that has weight to it, that presses against the silence and asks you to fill it. I did not fill it. "Mom," Diane said finally, "I was actually hoping you might be able to help us with that." I told her I would have to think about it. I told her that my finances were not as flexible as she might think. I told her, gently but clearly, that I was living on a fixed income and that my pension was what kept me stable. She said she understood completely. She said, of course, no pressure. She said she would figure something out. She called back 4 days later with a different approach. She had been thinking, she said, and she had come up with a plan. She started talking fast, the way she always did when she was building towards something. She talked about how I never went anywhere, how I spent all my time alone in that house, how Robert would have wanted me to live a little, how I had plenty saved, and what was I saving it for anyway? She said those last few words lightly, like a joke, but they landed with the dull weight of a stone. What was I saving it for anyway? I let that sit for a moment. I thought about 32 years of contributions, of watching that balance grow slowly and steadily like something alive, of the comfort of knowing it was there, of the nights after Robert died when I would pull out the most recent statement and just look at the number, not to spend it, just to feel like I was not completely alone in the world. I told her I would think about it. She called again 2 days later, and then again 2 days after that, each call a little more urgent than the last. Bryce had found the perfect dates. The prices were going to go up. Lily was so excited. She had already told her friends at school. I would not want to disappoint Lily, would I? And there it was. There was the real argument, wrapped in a 13-year-old girl's excitement, dangled in front of me like a lure. I want to be honest about something. There is a version of this story where I immediately recognized what was happening and responded with strength and clarity, where I said no, firmly and without explanation, and that was the end of it. I wish that were the story I am telling you, but the truth is that I wavered. I second-guessed myself. I thought about Lily's face. I thought about how long I had been alone in that house. I thought about Robert and what he would have wanted, and I made the mistake of believing that love and generosity were the same thing. I told Diane I would give her $8,000 toward the trip. Not the whole amount, half, because I still had enough sense left to protect the other half. She said that was wonderful. She said, "Thank you, Mom." She said she would make it up to me. I transferred the money on a Thursday morning in February. By Thursday afternoon, I had a voicemail from my bank. Diane had called them directly. She had posed as me, using information she had from the years of casual financial conversations I had let happen between us. She had my account numbers. She had my Social Security number. She had enough to get through their security questions, and she had authorized a transfer of the full amount remaining in my pension account, $22,640. The bank left a message asking me to call to confirm the transaction. I sat down at my kitchen table. I sat there for a long time. The coffee I had made that morning was still sitting on the counter, and I could see the steam had long since stopped rising from it. Outside the window, my rose bushes were bare and gray in the February cold. The neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed slowly on the street. I called the bank back. They confirmed what had happened. They were very apologetic. They said they had flagged it because the amount was unusually large. They said they needed my verbal confirmation to complete the transaction. I asked them to put a freeze on the account immediately and said I would be in the next morning. Then I called Diane. She answered on the second ring. "Mom, did the transfer go through? The travel agent needs the rest by end of day to hold our cabin." I heard myself say, "Tell me what you did, Diane." There was a pause. And then she did something that I had not anticipated. She did not lie. She did not pretend. She did not gaslight me or tell me I had misunderstood. She said, in a voice that had gone flat and matter-of-fact, that she had called the bank to make sure the full amount went through because she knew I was going to keep second-guessing myself, and she had just been trying to help me make the decision. She had been trying to help me. Those words, I will never forget them. "Diane," I said, "that is my pension. That is the money I live on." "You have the house," she said. "You own it free and clear. You're fine. And honestly, Mom, you never go anywhere. You never do anything with it. And Lily is so excited about this trip. You would be doing something real for your granddaughter, something she'll actually remember." "What about what I'll remember?" I asked. "What about whether I can pay my property taxes? What about whether I can afford my medications?" There was a silence. And then Diane said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since that conversation. She said, "Mom, you don't need that money anyway. You're just going to waste it sitting in that house doing nothing." That was the moment, right there, that sentence, the one that rearranged something inside me. Not broke it, rearranged it. Like when you move furniture in a room and suddenly the light falls differently and you see things you had not noticed before. I told Diane I had to go. I told her I needed to think. She told me not to wait too long because of the booking deadline. I hung up and I sat back down at my kitchen table and I looked out at my bare rose bushes and my cold coffee, and I thought about 32 years and what they amounted to. Then I called my bank back and I confirmed the freeze. Then I called my son, Kevin. Kevin is 38. He is not flashy like his sister. He works as an electrician, and he lives 40 minutes away with his wife, Maria, and their 2 boys. He is steady in the way that some people are just naturally steady, like good timber. And he had been watching his sister's behavior toward me with growing discomfort for years. When I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something very simple. He said, "Mom, what do you want to do?" Not what he thought I should do, what I wanted to do. I told him I was going to think very carefully before I answered that question. I spent 3 days thinking. During those 3 days, Diane called 11 times. I counted. Each call went to voicemail. Each message escalated slightly in urgency and slightly in resentment. By the 6th message, she was telling me I was being dramatic. By the 9th, she was crying. By the 11th, she was telling me that I had always put money before family, and this was exactly why she and her father had never been close. Her father, my Robert, who worked double shifts for 40 years so she could have dance lessons and a car on her 16th birthday and a college education, had never been close to her because of money. The audacity of that statement did something to me that I did not expect. It made me calm, deeply, completely calm, like the surface of a lake on a windless morning. I called Kevin back on the 4th day, and I told him what I had decided. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he laughed. Not unkindly, more like the laugh of someone who has just heard the ending of a story they knew was going to be good. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Completely," I said. "Do you need my help?" "Some of it," I said. "I'll tell you what. Here is what most people do not know about me. I do not advertise it. and I have no reason to. But after Robert died, I took 2 years of quiet and purposeful action to secure my future in ways that had nothing to do with sentiment. I had watched too many women my age find themselves suddenly alone and financially vulnerable, and I was not going to be one of them. I moved the majority of my savings into accounts and instruments that Diane did not know about. The pension was real, and the amount she had tried to steal was real, but it represented maybe a third of what I actually had. The rest was organized differently, in my name only, with security measures in place that required more than a phone call to access. I also, because Robert had always taught me to think several steps ahead, had documentation, receipts of every transfer I had made to Diane over the years, records of every phone call, and a very thorough journal that I had been keeping, without any particular agenda, just out of habit, for the past 4 years. My neighbor Helen, who is a retired paralegal and who has been my closest friend since our children were in elementary school together, had been reading entries from that journal with increasing alarm for the better part of 2 years. It was Helen who had first suggested, 6 months before any of this came to a head, that I speak to an attorney. I had not taken her advice then. I was taking it now. The attorney's name was Sandra Kwan, and Helen had worked with her briefly before her retirement. Sandra was small and precise and had a manner of listening that made you feel like every word you said was being filed away in perfect order. I brought my journal. I brought my bank statements. I brought the receipts. I brought the transcript I had made of Diane's voicemails, all 11 of them, which I had listened to 3 times and written out word for word. Sandra listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked a few questions. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Calloway, your daughter committed bank fraud." I had known that. I had said it to myself. But hearing it from someone else, in that clean and legal language, in that quiet office with the afternoon light coming through the blinds, made it real in a way it had not quite been before. Sandra explained my options. There was the criminal route, which was real and viable. There was also the civil route. And then there was what Sandra called the practical route, which was less about justice in the formal sense and more about protection. We talked for 2 hours. By the end, I had a plan. Part of the plan involved doing nothing visible for a while. No confrontations, no ultimatums, no dramatic announcements. Just silence. And behind the silence, preparation. Diane had been trying to reach me for 4 days by the time I finally called her back. When she heard my voice, she exhaled in relief so deep I could hear it through the phone. She immediately began talking. She apologized for some of what she had said. She backtracked on a few things. She mentioned Lily again. She said the travel agent was going to lose the reservation without a deposit by the end of the week. I listened to all of it. And when she had finished, I said, "Okay, Diane, I'll help with the trip." Another exhale, more relief. "Really? Oh, Mom, thank you. I knew you'd come around. I knew. I'll transfer something tomorrow," I said, "but I want you to come by the house first. I want to see you. Have dinner with me." She agreed immediately. She came the next evening, alone, without Bryce, which I had expected. She brought a bottle of wine I had not asked for and a box of chocolates that she knew I did not eat. She was dressed carefully, her hair done, her smile warm and slightly careful around the edges. I had dinner on the table, her favorite, pot roast with the carrots the way she liked them, and the rolls from the bakery she had loved since she was a child. The house was warm and clean. Candles on the table, everything soft and familiar and domestic. We ate, we talked. She was charming in the way she could be when she wanted something, which was genuinely charming, I will give her that. She asked about my roses. She asked about Helen. She mentioned Lily's recent school project with what seemed like genuine pride. She was being my daughter, the version of my daughter I had once believed was the real one. I poured her more wine. I asked her about the cruise itinerary. She pulled out her phone and showed me the ship, the ports, the excursions Lily was most excited about. She was glowing. She looked happy in a way that she rarely looked anymore, the stress of her and Bryce's financial struggles having worn something away from her over the years. I looked at her across the table, my daughter, this woman who had come from me, who had been a baby in my arms and a child in my kitchen and a teenager in my driveway learning to drive. And I felt two things simultaneously. I felt love, because you do not stop loving your children, no matter what they do. And I felt a clarity that was almost cold in its precision. I knew exactly what I was doing, I knew exactly why, and I was at peace with it. After dinner, she helped me clear the table. I offered her coffee. She accepted. We sat back down and she looked at me with that careful warmth and she said, "So you'll really help with the trip?" "I have something for you," I said. "It's in the kitchen, in the fridge actually. I put an envelope in there to keep it safe." She looked at me a little oddly. "In the fridge?" "I know," I said, and I smiled. "Old habits. Your father used to keep important papers in all kinds of strange places. I picked it up from him, I suppose." She smiled at that, a real smile, slightly sad, which reminded me that whatever else was true, she had loved her father. She stood up and went to the kitchen. I heard the refrigerator door open. And then I heard her scream. The scream was not elegant. It was not the kind of scream you hear in movies, sharp and clean and cinematic. It was raw and startled, and it bounced off the kitchen tiles and came barreling into the dining room like something alive. I sat very still, with my coffee cup in both hands, and I waited. "Mom." Her voice came first, before she appeared in the doorway. "Mom, what is this?" It was not a question. Not exactly. It had the shape of a question, but the weight of something else entirely. I turned to look at her. She was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, holding the envelope I had left in the refrigerator. Her face had gone the particular shade of pale that only comes when your body understands something before your mind catches up. In her other hand, she was holding what had been inside the envelope, and her fingers were shaking just slightly, just enough for me to notice. "Sit down, Diane," I said. "Mom, these are legal documents. I know what they are. I put them there. Sit down." She sat, not gracefully. She kind of lowered herself into the chair like her knees had stopped working properly. And she put both the envelope and the documents on the table between us, and she stared at them like they might do something unexpected. What she had found in the refrigerator was a letter from Sandra Kwan's office, 2 pages, single-spaced, laying out in very precise legal language exactly what Diane had done when she called my bank and impersonated me. It named the amount. It named the date. It referenced the bank's own security records. It used the phrase bank fraud twice and the phrase criminal liability once. Attached to the letter was a notarized affidavit documenting every financial transfer I had made to Diane over the previous 7 years. The total, which Sandra's paralegal had calculated with the same precision Sandra brought to everything, was $41,200. There was also a third document, a single page, which was a copy of a letter I had already sent 3 days prior to the bank's fraud department, formally reporting the unauthorized access to my account. Diane read it all. I watched her read it. I watched her eyes move across the pages, and I watched her expression cycle through several things in rapid succession. Shock first, then a kind of recalculation, then something that looked almost like anger but wasn't quite, because underneath the anger there was fear, and fear was doing the driving. "You already reported it," she said. "Yes. To the bank." "To the bank. And I've spoken to an attorney." She looked up at me. "Mom," her voice had shifted into something softer, something that in another context might have worked on me. "Mom, you're not actually going to—" "I don't know yet what I'm going to do," I said. "That depends on you." She put the papers down. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the table. Outside the window, it had started to rain. One of those thin, cold February rains that doesn't commit to anything, and I could hear it against the glass. "I was going to pay you back," she said. "When?" "When Bryce's commission comes through. He has a big deal closing in—" "Diane," I said it quietly, just her name, nothing else. She stopped talking. I have been giving you money for 7 years, I said. Do you know the total? $41,000. $41,000 that I gave you because I love you and because I believed you when you said you'd turn things around. And every time I gave you money, you came back. Every single time. And each time, the amount got a little bigger and the story got a little more urgent. And when I said I wasn't sure this time, you didn't argue with me or try to change my mind. You called my bank and you pretended to be me. You used my social security number. I know what I did, she said. Do you? She looked at me. Her eyes were bright with tears that had not fallen yet. I panicked, Mom. I was stressed, and I panicked, and it was a terrible decision, and I know that. But you were going to give me the money anyway. You told me you would. I was just helping me make the decision, I said. She flinched. That's what you told me, I said, on the phone, that you were helping me make the decision. I'm sorry, she said, and for a moment, just a moment, I believed her, because she looked it. She looked genuinely ashamed, the way she had looked as a small girl when she had done something she knew was wrong, before she learned to perform her emotions rather than feel them. Mom, I'm really sorry. What do you want me to do? I'll do anything. Please don't go to the police. Please. Think about Lily. And there was Lily again, 13 years old and unknowingly stationed between her mother and accountability every time Diane needed a shield. Lily is not part of this conversation, I said. She'd be devastated if... Diane, stop. She stopped. I picked up my coffee. I took a sip. It had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway. Here is what is going to happen, I said. You are going to listen. You are not going to interrupt. And then you are going to go home and you are going to think about what I've said, because I am giving you one opportunity to make this right, and I am not going to give you two. She nodded. Her jaw was tight. The money you took from my account has been recovered, I said. The bank froze the transaction before it cleared, so you do not have my money. What you have is a record of having attempted to take it. That record exists at the bank. It exists in my attorney's files. It exists in a letter that is currently sitting in a sealed envelope in Sandra Kwan's office with instructions on what to do with it if I ask her to act on it. I paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You're threatening me, Diane said. I am telling you the truth about your situation, I said. There is a difference. She looked down at the documents again. I watched her do the math. I watched her figure out that the ground she was standing on was not the ground she had thought it was. The $41,000, I said, I want it acknowledged. Not repaid immediately, I am not unreasonable, but acknowledged in writing, a promissory note, signed and notarized, with a repayment schedule that Sandra will help us structure. Diane's head came up. A promissory note. You want me to sign a legal document. Yes. Mom, we don't have... I know you don't have it right now. That's why it's a repayment schedule, not a demand for immediate payment. But I want it in writing, Diane. I want what was given and what is owed to exist on paper, because it doesn't exist anywhere else. It exists in my memory and in my journal and in my bank statements, but not in any form that you have ever acknowledged. She was quiet for a moment. The rain against the window was the only sound. And the fraud report, she said. What happens to that? That depends on what you do next. Meaning you'll hold it over me. I looked at her steadily. Meaning I am a 67-year-old woman on a fixed income, and my daughter tried to steal my pension, and I would like some security. Yes, Diane, the report stays where it is unless you give me a reason to pursue it. And if you give me a reason, I will pursue it without hesitation. Do you understand me? She was crying now, not the performative tears I had seen over the years, the kind that arrived conveniently when she needed sympathy. These were different, smaller. She was wiping at them almost impatiently, like they were inconvenient. How long have you been planning this? She said. Long enough. Did Kevin know? Kevin knows what I told him. She nodded slowly. Something shifted in her expression. Not acceptance exactly. More like the moment when you've been arguing that the weather isn't that bad, and you finally look out the window and see the snow. "The trip," she said, "is not happening," I said. "Not with my money." She nodded again, wiped her eyes, picked up her wine glass, and then put it back down without drinking from it. "Lily is going to be so disappointed." "Then you can explain to your daughter why the trip is not happening," I said. "And you can explain it honestly, or you can explain it however you choose. But that conversation is yours to have, not mine." Diane left at 9:15. She did not hug me when she went, which was the first honest thing she had done all evening. She took the documents with her because I had made copies and I told her to. She walked down the front path to her car, and she did not look back at the house. I stood at the door for a moment after she drove away. The rain had thinned to almost nothing. The street was quiet and wet, and the neighbor's porch light was on. And somewhere down the block, someone's wind chimes were going softly. I closed the door. I went back to the kitchen. I washed the dinner plates and dried them and put them away. I washed the wine glasses. I put the leftover pot roast in a container and put it in the refrigerator and stood there for a moment with the refrigerator door open, the cold air on my face, looking at the empty space where the envelope had been. Then I called Helen. "Well," she said. She took the documents. And she cried. Good crying or bad crying? "I think real crying," I said. "For once." Helen was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel?" I thought about it. "Hungry," I said. "I was too nervous to eat dinner. I'll have to heat up the leftovers." Helen laughed, and I laughed too, and it felt like something releasing, like a knot that had been pulled tight for months, finally going slack. The promissory note was signed 11 days later. Diane brought Bryce, which I had not expected. Bryce sat across from me at Sandra's conference table, and he looked like a man who had been through something and had not yet decided how to feel about it. He did not make eye contact with me for the first 20 minutes. When he finally did, he looked like he was going to say something, and then seemed to change his mind. Sandra was professional and unhurried, and she walked them through the document in the same clean, methodical way she did everything. When it was signed and notarized and the copies were distributed, Sandra offered coffee. Bryce said yes. Diane said no. I said yes. We sat in that conference room for a few minutes with our coffees and the strange, awkward quiet of people who have just done something that cannot be undone. And then Diane said, "I want you to know I'm going to pay it back. All of it." "I believe you," I said. She looked at me. "Do you?" "I do," I said, and I meant it. Not because I was certain she would, but because I had done what I could do, and the rest was not in my hands. Bryce cleared his throat. "Margaret," he said, "I want to say something." He said it looking at the table, not at me. "I didn't know she called the bank. I want you to know that. I knew she was going to ask you for the money. I didn't know about the call." I looked at him for a moment. He was still looking at the table. "Okay," I said. "I'm not saying that to excuse it," he said. "I just want you to know that I didn't know." "Okay, Bryce," I said, and I let it sit there. On the drive home that afternoon, I took the long way, past the street where Robert and I had lived in our first apartment, a narrow 2-bedroom with a kitchen so small you had to stand sideways at the stove. Past the elementary school where Diane had learned to read and Kevin had broken his arm on the monkey bars in 3rd grade. Past the church where Robert and I had gotten married in June of 1981, which was now a yoga studio, which Robert would have found hilarious. I thought about what Sandra had said to me the day I first walked into her office. She had said, "Mrs. Calloway, what do you want the outcome to be?" And I had thought about it for a long time before I answered, because I wanted to be honest with myself. What I had wanted was not revenge exactly. What I had wanted was to be seen, to have what I had built and what I had given and what I was owed, acknowledged by the person who had most taken it for granted. To stand in front of my daughter, not as the naive, sitting in that house doing nothing mother she had written off, but as the woman who had been paying attention all along. I had gotten that. I did not know if it would last. I did not know if Diane would change, or if the promissory note would be honored, or if the next crisis would bring her back to my door with another story. I knew the law. I knew Sandra's number. I knew my own limits in a way I had not known them 7 years ago, when I first transferred $5,000 without asking questions. What I had not anticipated was what happened 3 weeks after the meeting at Sandra's office. What I had not accounted for was Lily. She called on a Sunday afternoon, not Diane's number, her own cell phone, the one Kevin had gotten her for her birthday. She called, and when I answered, she said, "Grandma, it's me," in a voice that was trying very hard to sound casual and not entirely succeeding. "I know your voice, sweetheart," I said. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," she said, She paused. "Mom told me what happened. Some of it. Not all of it, I think, but some of it." Another pause. "She said the trip isn't happening because of money stuff. She made it sound like it was just, like, bad timing or whatever. But I heard her and Dad arguing one night, and I heard my name, and I heard your name, and I heard something about a bank, and Her voice wavered slightly. "I just wanted to call you." I sat down on the couch. "I'm glad you called," I said. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Are you and Mom okay?" "We're working on it," I said. "Your mom and I have some things we're figuring out, but that's between us. It's nothing that changes how I feel about you." "Did she do something bad?" I was quiet for a moment. 13 is old enough to know things and young enough to still be protected from some of them. "Your mom made a mistake," I said carefully, "and she's working on fixing it. That's what people do. They make mistakes and then they work on fixing them." "What if they make really big mistakes?" "Then it takes longer to fix," I said, "but you still try." Lily was quiet on the other end of the phone. I could hear her breathing, and in the background the faint sound of her television. "I didn't really care that much about the cruise," she said finally. "I mean, I did, but not like... Mom made it sound like it was this whole thing. I would have been fine." I felt something move through my chest. "I know, baby. I don't want things to be weird between you and Mom forever." "Things aren't going to be weird forever," I said. "I promise you that." After we hung up, I sat for a long time on the couch in the quiet house. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in late winter, when it comes through the windows at a low angle and makes everything look like it's coated in gold. My rose bushes outside were still bare, but I could see the first small hints of buds beginning, just barely, just the suggestion of them. I thought about Lily's voice, the careful way she had asked her questions, the loyalty she was trying to hold in 2 directions at once, toward her mother and toward me, at 13 years old. And I thought that if there was any real lasting damage here, it was not to my bank account or my dignity or even to my relationship with Diane. It was to that girl who had been pulled into something she had no part in creating and who was now trying to navigate the fallout with more grace than most adults I knew. That was the thing that stayed with me. Not the documents, not the voicemails, not Bryce's eyes fixed on the conference table. Lily's voice on the phone on a Sunday afternoon saying, "I just wanted to call you." I called Sandra the next morning. I told her I wanted to add something to the arrangement, something informal, not legally binding, just a condition I was putting on my own next steps. I told her I wanted monthly dinners, me and Diane, just the 2 of us, no Bryce, no lawyers, no agenda, just dinner. And once a month, a day with Lily, just the 2 of us, baking or gardening or whatever she wanted to do. Sandra looked at me with the expression of someone who was professionally obligated not to be surprised by anything, but personally found this unexpected. "You want to have dinner with her?" she said. "She's my daughter," I said. Sandra nodded slowly. "Do you want me to put that in writing?" "No," I said. "Some things don't need to be in writing." I called Diane that evening. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting for me to call. I told her what I wanted, the dinners, the time with Lily. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Yes." Not enthusiastically, not with the bright performed warmth of someone getting what they want. Just yes. Plain and honest and a little rough around the edges. "Okay," I said. "Next Friday then. I'll cook." "Okay," she said. There was a pause. "Mom," she said. "Yeah?" "I'm sorry. I know I said it before, but I want to say it again when I'm not sitting across from lawyers." I listened to the rain that had started up again outside. Same thin February rain, still not committing to anything. "I know you are," I said. "Let's make something of that." The first dinner was awkward. The second was a little less so. By the third, there were moments that felt, if not like what we'd had before, then like something new. Something more honest, maybe, less comfortable, but more real. Diane talked about her marriage in ways she never had before, not performing confidence, but actually saying that things were hard, that she and Bryce had been grinding against each other for years, that the money stress had become a kind of weather they lived inside of constantly. I listened. I did not offer money. I offered instead a referral to a financial counselor that Helen's son used, and the name of a couples therapist that Sandra had mentioned once, off the record. Diane took both numbers. I do not know yet what she did with them. What I know is this, that on the last Friday of March, I sat in my kitchen with my granddaughter Lily, and we made cinnamon rolls from scratch, the kind that take 3 hours from start to finish because you have to wait for the dough to rise twice. And she asked me how I learned to make them, and I told her about my own grandmother, who had made them every Sunday morning in a kitchen that smelled like vanilla and wood smoke, who had been the kind of woman who kept her own counsel and loved her family hard and never let either thing cancel out the other. Lily listened to the whole story. She was rolling the dough with both hands, and her hair was coming out of its ponytail, and she had flour on her cheek. And she listened with her whole self, the way children do before they learn to listen with only part of themselves. "She sounds cool," Lily said. "She was," I said. "She really was." Lily looked at me for a moment with those 13-year-old eyes that don't miss very much. "You're kind of like her," she said. I handed her the cinnamon to sprinkle. "I'm working on it," I said. Outside my kitchen window, the rose bushes had begun to bloom. The first 2 of the season, pale pink against the gray of the fence, opening like they did every year, on schedule, unhurried, unbothered by whatever winter had thrown at them. The cinnamon rolls were still on the counter cooling when Diane's car pulled into the driveway 3 hours early. Margaret watched through the kitchen window as her daughter got out of the car, and she knew immediately that something was wrong. Diane had a way of carrying bad news in her body before she ever opened her mouth. Her shoulders were pulled up toward her ears, and she was walking fast in that particular way that meant she was trying to hold herself together by moving quickly enough that the pieces didn't have time to fall. "Stay here," Margaret told Lily, who looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been doing homework while the rolls cooled. "Finish your chapter. I'll be right back." She met Diane at the front door before her daughter could knock. Diane's mascara was not smudged, which told Margaret she had been crying earlier, but had stopped and repaired herself before getting in the car. Her eyes were very bright. Her jaw was tight. She was holding her phone in one hand, and she was holding it the way people hold things when they need something to grip. "Can I come in?" Diane said. "Of course." Margaret stepped back. "Lily's in the kitchen." "Can we go somewhere else? Just for a minute?" They went to the living room. Margaret sat in the armchair Robert had bought 15 years ago that she had always meant to reupholster and never gotten around to. Diane sat on the edge of the couch and did not take her coat off. She looked at the floor for a moment, and then she held out her phone. "I found this last night," she said. Margaret took the phone. It was open to a text conversation. The contact name at the top was saved as Remy W., which meant nothing to her, and she looked at Diane with a question in her eyes, and Diane said, "Keep reading. Scroll up." She scrolled up. She read enough to understand. She did not read all of it because she did not need to. She handed the phone back. "How long?" Margaret asked. "I don't know yet." Diane's voice was flat and very controlled, in the way that voices get when they are 2 degrees away from coming apart. The messages go back at least 8 months. That's as far as I got before I stopped looking. Margaret said nothing for a moment. Outside, she could faintly hear Lily moving around in the kitchen, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. Does Lily know? No. She was at her friend's last night. I found it after she left. Diane pressed her fingers against her forehead. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the kitchen all night, and I kept thinking, I need to call Mom, which is... She made a sound that was almost a laugh, which is something, considering everything. You did the right thing, Margaret said. Diane looked at her. Did I? You called me instead of doing something you'd regret. Yes, you did the right thing. Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I keep thinking about what you said at the lawyer's office. You said some mistakes take longer to fix. She looked up. What if it's not fixable? Then it's not fixable, Margaret said, but you don't know that yet. I confronted him this morning, before he left for work. She stopped, started again. He didn't even really deny it. He said it wasn't what it looked like, and I said, Bryce, I read the texts. And he said I was invading his privacy. Her voice caught slightly on the last sentence. I was invading his privacy. Margaret felt something settle in her chest, cold and quiet. Where is he now? At work, or claiming to be. And where are you planning to sleep tonight? Diane blinked, like the question was one she hadn't gotten to yet. I hadn't thought about that. You and Lily will stay here tonight, Margaret said. You don't have to decide anything tonight, but you are not sitting alone in that house. Diane looked at her mother. Her expression did something complicated, something that moved through several things at once, relief and shame, and something that might have been the beginning of gratitude. Mom, she started. Don't. Margaret stood up. Go say hi to your daughter. Let her show you the cinnamon rolls. She did most of the work. What happened over the next 72 hours was the kind of thing that stretches time. Margaret had lived long enough to know that crisis does that. It makes hours feel like days and days feel like a season. And she moved through it with the same deliberate steadiness she had brought to every hard thing since Robert died. Bryce came to the house that evening. He rang the doorbell at 6:45, and Margaret answered it because Diane was upstairs with Lily, running a bath and pretending normalcy, the way mothers do when their children are watching. Bryce stood on the porch in his work coat, and he looked, Margaret thought, like a man who had been caught and had not yet decided whether to be sorry or defensive about it. Margaret, he said. Bryce, is Diane here? She is. Can I talk to her? That's up to her. Margaret held the door without opening it wider. I'll ask, she paused, but I want to say something first. He waited. I don't know what's happening between you and my daughter, she said, and I am not going to pretend I don't have opinions about you that were formed before tonight. But Diane is going to make her own decisions about her marriage. I'm not going to make them for her. What I am going to tell you is that whatever she decides, I am standing behind her, completely. And if you treat her badly during this, if you pressure her or gaslight her or try to use Lily as leverage, you will find out very quickly how protected she is. She said it without heat, simply and plainly, the way you state a fact about the weather. Do you understand me? Bryce stared at her for a moment. Something moved across his face. Yes, he said. Good. She stepped back. Come in, I'll get her. Diane and Bryce talked in the dining room for an hour, while Margaret and Lily watched a nature documentary in the living room, with the volume slightly higher than necessary. Lily kept glancing toward the dining room. Margaret kept her eyes on the screen, and occasionally said things like, "Look at that," and "interesting," at appropriate moments, to maintain the fiction that they were both watching it. At one point, Lily said, very quietly, "Are they fighting?" "They're talking," Margaret said. "About what?" "Grown-up stuff." She put her arm around her granddaughter. "Your job right now is to watch the penguins." Lily leaned into her. "Okay," she said. But she didn't really watch the penguins. When Bryce left, Margaret heard the front door close with a quietness that was somehow worse than a slam. Diane came into the living room and sat in the armchair that had been Robert's, and she looked at Lily and she said, "Hey, baby." "Hey," Lily said. She was watching her mother very carefully. "We're going to be okay," Diane said. To Lily. Just to Lily. "Whatever happens, we're going to be okay. I want you to know that." Lily nodded, slow and deliberate, like she was taking the words in one at a time and storing them somewhere safe. "Okay," she said. "Are we staying here tonight?" "If Grandma'll have us." "Obviously," Margaret said from the couch. Lily uncurled herself and went to her mother, and Diane held her the way you hold a child when you're the one who needs the comfort as much as they do. And Margaret looked at the television and let them have the moment. Kevin called the next morning. Margaret had texted him the night before, just enough to let him know what was happening, and he called at 7:30 when she was in the kitchen making coffee, and the house was still quiet. "How is she?" he said. "Holding together." "And Lily?" "She's good. She's resilient." Margaret poured coffee. "Your sister needs a lawyer. Not Sandra, a family attorney, someone who handles divorce." There was a silence on Kevin's end. "Is she filing?" "I don't know yet, but she needs to know her options before Bryce's commission clears, if that commission is even real, and she needs someone in her corner before any financial decisions get made." Kevin let out a breath. "I'll call around today." "I already have a name," Margaret said. "Sandra gave it to me this morning. I called her at 7. Kevin was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Mom, sometimes you scare me." "Good," Margaret said. "Someone should be scared of me." He laughed. It was Robert's laugh, that same slight catch at the beginning, and it moved through Margaret like something warm. The attorney Sandra referred them to was a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had an office downtown and who, according to Sandra, was excellent and did not suffer fools. Margaret drove Diane to the appointment that Thursday. Lily was at school. Bryce had gone back to the house, which was in his name and Diane's jointly, and Diane had returned for a night to gather clothes and documents, and had come back to Margaret's with 2 suitcases and the expression of someone who has crossed a threshold and closed the door behind them. Patricia Okafor was a tall woman with close-cropped hair and glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the same quality Sandra had of listening without performing it. She asked Diane questions for 40 minutes. Diane answered them all, clearly and directly, in the careful, flat voice she had been using since Monday night, the voice of someone rationing their emotional resources because they were not sure how long they would need to make them last. At the end of the 40 minutes, Patricia took her glasses off the chain and put them on and looked at the notes she had made and said, "The finances are the complicated part. The rest is straightforward." She looked at Diane. "Tell me everything about the joint accounts, all of them." What came out over the next hour was worse than Margaret had expected. She sat in the chair against the wall, which Diane had asked her to, not to participate but just to be there, and she listened as the shape of her daughter's actual financial situation emerged from under the version Diane had been presenting for years. Bryce had debt that Diane had not known the full extent of. Credit cards in his name that had been pulling against their joint accounts in ways Diane had either not noticed or had chosen not to look at closely. The commission he had mentioned repeatedly as being imminent was for a deal that Patricia, making a phone call while they sat there, confirmed had fallen through 4 months ago. There was a second phone line on their account that Diane had not known about. There was a payment going out monthly to an address in a city 3 hours away that neither Diane nor Patricia could immediately explain. Diane sat very still through all of this. Her hands were in her lap. Her face was composed in a way that Margaret recognized as the outer surface of something that was barely holding. When Patricia finished, she looked at Diane and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly. Not for my benefit, but for yours. How much of this did you know?" Diane was quiet for a long moment. "Less than I should have," she said finally, "and more than I admitted to myself." Patricia nodded like this was an answer she respected. "Okay," she said, "here's what we're going to do." On the drive home, Diane looked out the window for a long time without speaking. Margaret drove and let the silence be. She had learned a long time ago that some silences needed to breathe before they became words. They were stopped at a red light when Diane said, "I gave him money too. Some of the money I took from you. I told myself it was for the trip, but it wasn't all for the trip. She was still looking out the window. Some of it went into an account he told me was for emergencies. I transferred it, and I didn't ask questions. Margaret kept her hands on the wheel. How much? About $6,000 of what I took from you. The light changed. Margaret drove. Did you know what it was actually for? No. Diane's voice was very quiet. But I think I knew it wasn't what he said it was. I think I just didn't want to look. She finally turned away from the window. I'm sorry, Mom. I know that doesn't fix it. You'll need to tell Patricia about the $6,000, Margaret said. I know. It changes the picture. I know. They drove in silence for another few minutes. Then Diane said, I've been such an idiot. No, Margaret said. Mom, being deceived is not the same as being an idiot. Bryce is good at what he does. I've watched him do it for 13 years. He is a man who knows how to make you feel like you're always one step behind and like that's your fault. And he has been doing that to you for a very long time. She paused. What you did to me was wrong. I am not taking that back. But I think you were also scared and in a hole that someone else helped dig, and you were grabbing at anything you could reach. Diane was crying now. Not the careful, repaired crying of Monday night. Real crying. The kind that doesn't care what it looks like. She pressed her hand against her mouth. You should have come to me, Margaret said, before all of it. You should have just come to me. I was ashamed, Diane said. I didn't want you to know how bad it was. I'm your mother, Margaret said. There is nothing you could show me that would make me stop. That night, after Lily was asleep in the spare room, Margaret and Diane sat at the kitchen table with decaf coffee and the leftover cinnamon rolls that had been sitting on the counter for 3 days and were slightly past their best, but neither of them cared. They talked for 2 hours. Not about lawyers or documents or Bryce or finances. They talked about other things. About Robert. About the years when the kids were small and money was tight, and Margaret and Robert had fought about it sometimes, real fights, and how they had come through them. About the summer Diane was 16 and had wanted to quit school, and Margaret had handled it wrong and had spent years thinking about that. About things that had never been said, because there had never been a night quiet enough and stripped of enough pretense to say them. At some point Diane said, Why didn't you tell me when I was making the bad decisions? The Bryce ones, the early ones. I know you saw it. Margaret thought about it honestly. Because you would have heard it as me telling you I was right and you were wrong, she said. And you would have dug in. You've always dug in when you think someone's trying to win. Diane considered this. That's probably true. I waited too long, Margaret said, and then I overcorrected when I was hurt. Both things are true. You didn't overcorrect, Diane said. You protected yourself. You had every right. I know I did, Margaret said, but I want you to know I didn't enjoy it. I want you to know that the smartest thing I've ever done that made me feel the least good was that dinner, watching you read those documents. She looked at her daughter. That's not nothing. Diane nodded slowly. It's something, she said. Patricia moved fast. Within 2 weeks, she had a full picture of the couple's finances, and the picture was not pretty. What emerged was a marriage that had been financially underwater for years, held together by a combination of Diane's inherited optimism and Bryce's talent for misdirection. Patricia also found, through a contact she did not explain, that the address the monthly payments had been going to was an apartment, and the apartment had a lease in Bryce's name. Not Remy, a different name entirely. When Patricia told Diane, Diane sat very still for a long moment, and then she said, How long? The lease started 2 years ago, Patricia said. Diane closed her eyes. When she opened them, she said, File the paperwork. Margaret was in the waiting room when Diane came out. She could read her daughter's face from across the room. She stood up, and Diane walked to her, and Margaret put her arms around her. This woman who had been her baby and her trial and her heartbreak and her pride. And Diane held on for a long time. 2 years, Diane said into her shoulder. I know, Margaret said. The whole time he was telling me we were broke. The whole time he was... She stopped, started again. And I was so desperate I tried to steal from you. You are not going to spend the rest of your life connecting those two things, Margaret said firmly. What he did is his. What you did is yours. They are separate. Diane pulled back. How do you do that? How do you just separate things so cleanly? Practice, Margaret said. 30 years of it. Kevin drove up that weekend. He brought Maria and the boys, and the house filled with noise in a way it hadn't since the kids were young. The boys were 8 and 10, and they had opinions about everything, and energy that appeared to be physically unlimited. And Lily attached herself to them immediately, with the relief of someone who had been living inside a quiet, grown-up drama and needed desperately to just run around a backyard for a few hours. Kevin pulled Margaret aside in the kitchen while the kids were outside, and Maria was helping Diane with something in the living room. She doing okay? He said. She will be, Margaret said. He nodded. He leaned against the counter. You know what I keep thinking about, he said? That summer after Dad died, when she drove down here every other weekend and sat with you, and I kept thinking, good, they have each other. They're getting close. He looked at her. I think she was already starting to worry about money then. I think that's why she was coming. Maybe, Margaret said. Maybe not. People can do something for the wrong reason and the right reason at the same time. I don't want to revise every memory. Kevin looked at her steadily. You're a better person than me, he said. I'm not, she said. I'm just older. You'll get there. He laughed and she handed him a dish towel and told him to make himself useful. At dinner that evening, Margaret looked down the length of her table. Kevin at one end cutting the bread, Maria passing the salad, the two boys arguing cheerfully about something that appeared to involve a video game, Lily sitting between her grandmother's chair and the window, describing something that had happened at school that week, her hands moving expressively the way Diane's had when she was young. And Diane herself, sitting across from Kevin, still carrying something heavy behind her eyes, but eating, talking, present. Margaret thought about February, about standing in the kitchen with a cold cup of coffee while her daughter explained to her what would happen to her own money, about the knot between her ribcage and her stomach, about the moment she decided to stop being the person being rearranged and start being the person doing the rearranging. She thought about Sandra Kwan's question, what do you want the outcome to be? She had wanted to be seen. She had wanted the thing she built acknowledged. She had wanted to stand in front of her daughter not as the woman doing nothing in that house, but as herself, fully, with all the weight and intention and resource she actually had. She had gotten that. She had also, somewhere she had not exactly planned for, gotten something she had been missing for years without knowing it. She had gotten back something in Diane that was worth keeping. Not the Diane who brought wine she hadn't asked for and performed warmth at the dinner table. The other one. The one who sat at midnight with cold coffee and said things she had been afraid to say. It was not a neat resolution. Bryce's lawyers were going to make the divorce complicated. The financial untangling was going to take time, and Patricia said it might get ugly before it got clean. Diane and Lily would need to figure out where to live. There were going to be bad days, and arguments, and moments when the progress they had made felt impossibly fragile. But Margaret had lived long enough to know that things did not resolve. They evolved. You did not get to a place where everything was fixed and stable and required no further attention. What you got, if you were lucky and deliberate and willing to stay in the room, was a relationship that was real, that had been tested and had not entirely broken, that knew what it was made of. She picked up her water glass. She did not make a toast, did not draw anyone's attention. She just held it for a moment and looked down the table and thought about Robert, who would have handled all of this very differently and probably with less paperwork, but with the same fundamental intention: to keep the family in the room, to keep the people he loved where he could see them. She set the glass down. "More bread?" Kevin said from the other end of the table. "Please," she said. He passed it, and she took a piece, and the conversation moved on around her. And outside the kitchen window, the roses were opening, pink and unhurried, like they had all the time in the world. The divorce papers were served on a Tuesday morning in April, and by Tuesday afternoon, Bryce had called Margaret's house 4 times. She did not answer any of them. She let them go to voicemail, and she listened to all 4 messages, standing in her kitchen, with her arms crossed and her coffee going cold on the counter, which had become something of a habit in her life lately. The first message was controlled and businesslike. He wanted to talk. He thought there had been a miscommunication. The second was slightly less controlled. He believed Margaret had been influencing Diane's decisions, and he wanted her to understand that this was a family matter. The third dropped the businesslike pretense entirely, and his voice had taken on the texture of a man who was feeling cornered and did not like how it felt. He said that Margaret had always interfered, that Diane had always run to her mother, that he was not going to let this be decided by 2 women who had it out for him. The fourth message was an apology for the third message. He said he was under a lot of stress. Margaret deleted all 4 and called Patricia. "He left me messages," she said. "Don't respond," Patricia said immediately. "Don't engage with him at all. If he contacts you again, document it and send me the recordings. I already recorded them." A brief pause. "Of course you did," Patricia said. "I'll note it." What Margaret had not anticipated, even with all her preparation, was how much of the next 2 months would be lived in the space between waiting and not knowing. Patricia had warned her that the divorce proceedings would move at their own speed, and that speed would not be fast. Bryce had hired an attorney who specialized in making things complicated, which Patricia described without any particular alarm as entirely expected. And the financial untangling that had seemed difficult in the first meeting got progressively more intricate as more of Bryce's accounting came to light. He had been siphoning. That was the word Patricia used. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily and over years. Money that should have gone into their joint account had been redirected in small enough increments that it had read as normal fluctuation rather than pattern. It was the kind of financial deception that required patience and attention to detail, which Margaret found interesting because in every other area of his life, Bryce had displayed neither quality. Diane was staying in Margaret's spare room with Lily, who had moved schools and adapted with the kind of matter-of-fact resilience that 13-year-olds sometimes deploy when the adults around them are visibly struggling, and the child understands instinctively that one more struggling person will not help. She did her homework at Margaret's kitchen table. She helped with dinner without being asked. She treated the whole arrangement with a practicality that was both admirable and slightly heartbreaking, like a small person who has decided that being easy is the most useful thing they can do. Bryce requested a meeting in May through his attorney. Not a legal proceeding, just a meeting. He wanted to speak to Diane directly, with their respective attorneys present, to discuss an informal settlement arrangement. Patricia advised Diane to attend. Margaret drove her. She did not go inside. She sat in the parking lot of Patricia's office building, and she read a book she had brought for exactly this purpose. And she did not look up at the building, and she did not check her phone every 5 minutes. Or she did check it, but she made herself put it down after each check and returned to the page. Diane came out an hour and 20 minutes later. She walked across the parking lot and got in the passenger seat. And she sat there for a moment, and Margaret closed her book and waited. "He cried," Diane said. Margaret said nothing. Real crying, not performance. He actually cried. She pressed her fingers against her collarbone like she was taking her own pulse. He said he was sorry. He said he'd been drowning, and he'd handled it completely wrong, and he was sorry. She looked at the dashboard. "He looked terrible, Mom. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks." What did Patricia say about the settlement offer? Diane turned to look at her. "You're not going to ask me what I felt?" "I know what you felt," Margaret said quietly. "I'm asking what Patricia said about the offer, because that's the part you need to think about with your head and not your heart." Diane held her gaze for a moment. She said it's low, significantly low. He's offering to let me keep the car and my personal accounts, and he wants to keep the house. And the house is worth $400,000 and has $40,000 left on the mortgage. So he's offering you a 12-year-old car and accounts that are nearly empty in exchange for equity of $360,000, Margaret said. When you say it like that, that is what it is, Margaret said. What did Patricia tell you to do? She said decline and counter. She already has the counter drafted. Diane looked back at the windshield. I signed it before I came out. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Good. It doesn't feel good, Diane said. It feels like I'm fighting someone who used to be my person. He stopped being your person before you knew he did, Margaret said. You're not fighting who he was. You're protecting yourself from what he actually is. Diane turned away. She looked out the side window for a long moment. He asked about you, she said. About me. He said you had poisoned the relationship, that you had been trying to separate us for years. She paused. He said the money thing, the pension thing. He said I only came to you about it because you had trained me to run to you whenever there was a problem. Margaret thought about that for a moment. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about hard things, without reflexive defensiveness. Was he right, she asked. Diane turned back to look at her. No, she said, and she said it flatly, with a certainty that was not performed. You didn't train me to run to you. For years I didn't come to you at all, because I was ashamed, and because he had spent a long time telling me you were controlling, and that I was too dependent on you. And I believed him. She stopped. That's the thing I keep landing on, how long I believed him over you. Margaret said, You're here now. I'm here now, Diane agreed. She reached over and squeezed Margaret's hand once, briefly, and then let go. Can we get lunch? I need to eat something and not think about lawyers for 45 minutes. Yes, Margaret said. She started the car. There's a place on Mercer that Helen likes. Good soup. Helen, it turned out, was already at the place on Mercer, having lunch with a woman Margaret did not recognize. And when they walked in, Helen looked up and her face did the thing it always did, which was tell you exactly what she was thinking, a full 3 seconds before she organized it into an expression. Her face said, This is interesting. And then it said, I will not make this awkward. And then she smiled and waved. They sat at a table across the restaurant and ordered soup and sandwiches, and Diane talked for a while about Lily's end-of-year school project, which apparently involved building something structural out of pasta, and Margaret listened and asked questions and made appropriate responses. And gradually the tension in Diane's shoulders came down from somewhere around her ears to somewhere closer to where it was supposed to be. Halfway through the meal, Diane said, I want to go back to work. Margaret looked up from her bowl. I stopped when Lily was born because Bryce said we didn't need the money, and then I stayed stopped because it was easier. She was moving her spoon around in the soup. I have a degree. I have skills. They're dusty, but they're there. Patricia says the settlement, even with the counter, is probably going to take another 3 or 4 months, and I can't just sit in your spare room and wait. What kind of work are you thinking? Event coordination, maybe. I did it before Lily. I was good at it. She finally ate the spoonful of soup. Or something adjacent, I don't know yet, but I need to be doing something. I need to be contributing to my own life again. She said the last sentence with a quiet intensity that made it clear she had been turning it over for a while. I know someone, Margaret said. Diane looked at her. Not a favor, a legitimate lead. Sandra's husband runs a corporate events company. He mentioned at Sandra's holiday party last year that he was looking for experienced coordinators. I have her number. Margaret paused. But I want to be clear. I will give you the number. What you do with it is yours. Diane nodded slowly. Not a handout. Not a handout. Okay, she said. Give me the number. The call happened 3 days later, and the meeting happened the week after that. And Diane came home from it moving differently than she had been moving for months. Her spine straighter, her voice carrying something that had been absent. She had the job. Part-time to start, enough to begin rebuilding something that was hers. Margaret watched her daughter walk into the kitchen that evening and pour a glass of water and lean against the counter and say to Lily, who was doing homework, I got the job. And Lily said, Seriously? And Diane said, Seriously. And Lily said, Mom, that's so good, in the voice of a child who means it entirely. And the two of them stood in the kitchen, holding each other. And Margaret stayed in the hallway and did not go in. Some moments belonged to them. It was the second week of June when Bryce made his move. Margaret should have seen it coming because she knew the type, and she had been watching him long enough to understand his pattern, which was to behave well when he was afraid, and then, when the fear subsided slightly and was replaced by resentment, to act. He showed up at Lily's school, not to pick her up. He was not on the approved pickup list because Patricia had moved quickly on that in the early days. He showed up at the fence at the edge of the school's track during afternoon PE, and Lily saw him. And Lily, who was 13 and not a child, but not yet entirely not one either, stood very still at the edge of the track field and stared at her father through the chain-link fence and did not know what to do. Her PE teacher noticed and went to stand beside her. Bryce called Lily's name. The teacher told him he needed to contact the school office. Bryce said he just wanted to talk to his daughter. The teacher said, firmly and without raising her voice, that he needed to step back from the fence. He said some things that Margaret heard about secondhand and chose not to repeat, and then he left. Lily texted Diane immediately after. The text said, "Dad was at the fence." Diane was in her second week of work when she got the text, and she called Margaret from the parking lot of the building where her new office was before she called Patricia, which Margaret understood and did not take as her rightful position in the hierarchy, but simply as the fact of what their relationship had become. "I'm calling Patricia next," Diane said. Her voice was tight and very controlled. "I just needed to hear you first." "Call Patricia," Margaret said. "I'll get Lily." She drove to the school. She signed in at the office, and the vice principal, a woman named Carla who had been there long enough to have seen many versions of this particular situation, walked her to the counselor's office, where Lily was sitting with a cup of water and her backpack in her lap, like she was ready to leave as quickly as possible. Lily looked up when Margaret came in, and her face did something complicated. It tightened, and then it released, and she said, "Hi, Grandma," in a voice that was trying to be normal and not entirely making it. "Hey, sweetheart," Margaret sat down next to her. "You okay?" "He didn't do anything. He just stood there." "I know." "I don't know why it felt so scary. He literally just stood at a fence." "Because you're not supposed to have to see your dad at a fence," Margaret said quietly. "You're supposed to be able to just run track." Lily looked at her hands. "Is Mom okay?" "She's handling it. She's calling the lawyer." Margaret put her hand on Lily's. "Your job right now is to let the adults do the adult things, and you just be a kid for the rest of today. Can you do that?" "Yeah." Lily looked up. "Can we get ice cream?" "Absolutely," Margaret said. Patricia moved on the fence incident immediately. It became part of the formal record. Bryce's attorney attempted to frame it as a father who missed his daughter, which Patricia described to Diane as a predictable tactic and not one she was worried about. But what it did, Margaret could see, was light something under the proceedings that accelerated things. Judges did not look kindly on documented violations of established informal arrangements, particularly when there was a minor involved and a clear pattern of boundary testing. The settlement negotiation got sharper after that. There were 3 more formal meetings over 6 weeks. Margaret did not attend any of them. She drove Diane to 2 of them and waited in the parking lot with her book. She watched her daughter walk into buildings and come back out carrying the weight of her own decisions, and she thought each time that this was what it looked like. Not recovery, not repair, but the slow construction of something from the ground up. It was not pretty work. It was not fast, but it was real. The agreement was reached on a Thursday in late July. Diane got the house. She got primary physical custody of Lily, with Bryce having scheduled visitation. She got a financial settlement that Patricia described as fair but not generous, and fair was enough. Bryce's attorney had argued hard for the house, and Patricia had argued harder. Margaret was in her kitchen making dinner when Diane called from Patricia's office parking lot. "It's done," Diane said. Margaret put down the wooden spoon. "What did you get?" Diane told her. Margaret listened to all of it. When Diane finished, Margaret said, "Patricia earned her fee." Diane made a sound that was part laugh and part something else. "She really did." Then she said, "Mom, I can move back into my house. My house. I mean, I have to negotiate the transition with his stuff, and there are going to be things to sort out, but she stopped. I have my house. Yes, Margaret said, you do. I can't believe... Her voice cracked slightly. Just slightly. She caught it. I'm sorry. I was trying not to. It's a parking lot, Diane. Nobody's watching. Diane laughed, the real kind, and Margaret stood in her kitchen and listened to her daughter laugh in a parking lot, and she pressed her free hand flat against the kitchen counter and let herself feel the full weight of the last 6 months, everything it had cost and everything it had returned. And she did not cry, but she felt the pressure of it behind her eyes for a moment, like weather. That evening, Kevin drove up. He had not been told in advance. Margaret had not called him. He simply showed up at the front door at 7:30 with Maria and a bottle of champagne and his elder boy carrying a grocery bag full of things for dinner that they had apparently assembled on the way over. He came through the door and he saw Diane's face and he said, "Yeah?" And Diane said, "Yeah." And he grabbed her in a hug that lifted her slightly off the floor, and Lily said, "Uncle Kevin, you're embarrassing," from the hallway, and Kevin said, "Absolutely," and didn't let go. Margaret stood at the edge of all of it and watched. Kevin and Maria taking over her kitchen with the comfortable ease of people who had done it before. Lily showing her cousin something on her phone. Diane at the kitchen table with a glass of champagne and a color in her face that had not been there in months. At some point, Kevin came and stood beside Margaret, and they both looked at the room. "You did this," he said quietly. Not like a statement of credit, more like an observation. "We all did this," she said. "You started it." She thought about February, about the cold coffee and the bare rose bushes, about the sound of Diane's voice on the phone saying, "You're just going to waste it sitting in that house doing nothing." About the moment something in her rearranged and she decided to stop being the furniture and start being the room. "I was tired of being underestimated," she said. Kevin nodded. He understood that. He handed her a glass of champagne, and she took it. What happened 3 days later was the thing Margaret had not seen coming, not because she had not been paying attention, but because some things arrive in the shape of the opposite of what you expect. Bryce called, not to her phone this time, but to Kevin's. Kevin told her about it the next morning. He had called Kevin at 9 in the evening, and Kevin had almost not answered, but had, and Bryce had talked for 20 minutes. He was not angry. He was not threatening. He was, Kevin said, sounding like a man who had run out of the energy required to be either of those things. He said he knew he had burned everything down. He said he knew he had no right to ask for anything. He said he had been in therapy for 6 weeks, which Kevin had no way to verify, but which he said had the ring of something true. He said he was not asking Diane to forgive him or take him back or pretend any of it had not happened. He was asking, through Kevin, whether there was a way he could have a real relationship with his daughter, not the forced, scheduled visitation, a real one. Kevin told him to write it down and send it to Patricia. Then Kevin had called Margaret. She sat with it for a full day. She thought about it while she gardened, while she drove to the store, while she made dinner for herself alone in the house that felt emptier now that Diane and Lily were gone from it. Emptier than it had before they arrived, which was a new kind of quiet that she was still calibrating. She thought about Lily at the fence, the way she had held her backpack in the counselor's office like she needed something to grip. She thought about the version of Bryce who had called Kevin at 9 in the evening with nothing left to fight for. She thought about what she had told Diane in the car after the meeting in Patricia's office. Some mistakes take longer to fix. She had said that about Diane, about her own daughter, and she had meant it and she had stood behind it. She called Diane the following morning. "Kevin told me about Bryce's call," Diane said immediately, which meant Kevin had already talked to her, and Margaret was not surprised. "What do you think?" Margaret asked. Silence for a moment. "I think Lily deserves a father if there's any part of him worth being one," Diane said slowly. "I think I don't know yet if there is, and I think that is Lily's decision to make when she's old enough to make it clearly. Not mine, and absolutely not his to demand. "I think that's right," Margaret said. "Do you think he's changed?" Margaret considered the question honestly. "I think he's exhausted," she said. "Whether that becomes change is something only time is going to answer." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Mom," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "If Dad had done something like this, if he had, I don't know, something big, something that really hurt you, would you have given him the chance to come back from it?" Margaret stood at her kitchen window. The roses were at full bloom now, deep pink and crowded and leaning toward the light. She had planted those roses the year Diane was born. She had tended them through 41 years of life in this house, through good years and hard years, and the 9 years of quiet since Robert left. And every spring they came back, not because of anything special she did, but simply because they were built that way, to survive the winters and return. She thought about Robert, about all of it, about the real answer to Diane's question, which was not simple and which she did not owe to anyone except, perhaps, to herself. "Yes," she said finally, "probably yes. Because you loved him." "Because I loved him," she said, "and because I believed in what we had built together, even when it was hard, even when I was angry." She paused. "But Diane, what Bryce did is not what your father ever did. Your father made mistakes, human ones. What Bryce did was a pattern, maintained deliberately, for years. Those are different things. One is a stumble, the other is a decision. Don't confuse them because you're feeling something tonight." Diane breathed on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said. "Okay, you're right." "What does Lily say about him?" "She doesn't talk about him much. She talks around him, mentions things from before, and then stops herself, like she's not sure if she's allowed." Diane's voice got quieter. "That's the part that kills me, that she's not sure if she's allowed to miss her father." "Tell her she is," Margaret said. "Tell her, clearly. She needs to hear you say it." There was a pause. "I will," Diane said. The conversation stayed with Margaret long after she hung up. She sat in Robert's armchair in the living room, the one she had never reupholstered, and she sat in the familiar shape of it, the worn armrests and the angle of the back that was specific to him. And she thought about what she had built and what it had cost and what it had returned. She had wanted to be seen. She had wanted to stop being the woman sitting in that house doing nothing. She had wanted the things she had given and sacrificed and built to be acknowledged. She had gotten all of that. She had also gotten something she had not put in the plan, something that did not appear on any of Sandra's documents or in any of the legal correspondence or in the careful journal she had kept. She had gotten her daughter back. Not the performed version, not the one who brought wine she hadn't asked for and sat with careful warmth at the dinner table. The real one, the one who cried in parking lots and asked hard questions and admitted what she had known and looked away from and sat at a kitchen table at midnight saying things she had been afraid to say. That was not nothing. That was, Margaret thought, perhaps the thing that mattered most. The first payment on the promissory note arrived on the 1st of August. It was smaller than the scheduled amount by about $200, which Margaret noted and filed away and said nothing about, because Diane had a new job and a house to set up and a daughter and a life being rebuilt from the ground up, and $200 was not the point. The point was the check. The point was that it came. She deposited it and wrote the date in her journal. Then she went outside to her roses, and she deadheaded the blooms that had gone past their best, and she checked the soil, and she watered them carefully at the base the way you were supposed to, not overhead, not wastefully, just what they needed and nothing more. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the street. A car passed slowly. Somewhere in the distance, there were children shouting the aimless, cheerful shouts of summer with nowhere in particular to be. Margaret straightened up. She brushed the soil from her hands. She looked at her garden, at the roses and the late summer light and the quiet, ordinary afternoon of her life, and she thought that this was what 67 looked like when you had done it right. Not easy, not without cost, but upright, your own. rooted in something real enough to come back from the winters. She went inside and made coffee, and this time she sat down with it before it got cold. The second payment arrived on time. The third came 4 days early, which was the first real surprise. Margaret noticed it on a Tuesday morning when she checked her account online, something she did every week now, not out of anxiety, but out of habit, the way you check the weather even when you're not going anywhere. She saw the deposit, saw that it had cleared $212 more than the scheduled amount, and she sat with her coffee and looked at the number for a long moment. She called Diane. "I see you sent extra this month," she said. "I got my first full paycheck." Diane's voice had that new quality to it, the one that had been developing since she started working again, a kind of groundedness that had not been there before. "I wanted to send more." "You don't have to rush it." "I know I don't have to," Diane said. "I want to." Margaret set down her coffee. "Okay," she said. "I hear you." "Mom," Diane paused, "can I come for dinner this week? Just me, not a monthly check-in. I just want to come." "Thursday," Margaret said. "I'll make pot roast." "Not pot roast," Diane said immediately. "Why not?" "Because the last time you made pot roast, I found legal documents in the refrigerator, and I screamed loud enough for the neighbors to check if you were alive." Margaret laughed. It came out full and unguarded, the way laughter does when it catches you before you can be dignified about it. "Fair point," she said. "I'll make something else." Diane came Thursday. She brought flowers, not wine, which was different, and she set them on the counter and then stood in the kitchen, the way she used to stand as a teenager, one shoulder against the doorframe, watching her mother cook. Margaret handed her a knife and a cutting board without asking and pointed at the onions, and Diane moved to the counter without complaint, which was also different, and they worked side by side in the kitchen and talked about small things. Lily's new friend group, Kevin's younger boy's loose tooth, the book Margaret had been reading and the one Diane had started on her commute. At no point did either of them mention Bryce or Patricia or the promissory note or February. Not because those things did not exist, but because they had found, slowly and without planning it, a way to carry them that did not require setting them on the table every time they were in the same room. The weight was still there. It would probably always be there in some form, but weight distributed correctly becomes something you can live with, and they had spent enough months redistributing it to know where it sat best. After dinner, Diane helped clear the table, and then she said, "I have to tell you something." Margaret sat back down. She recognized the tone. Not the urgent, tight tone of crisis, something quieter. "Bryce asked to see Lily," Diane said. "Not through the legal arrangement. He called me directly. He said he'd been writing letters to her but not sending them, and his therapist told him he needed to actually ask." She folded her napkin on the table. "He asked if I would consider a dinner, the three of them, just dinner, somewhere public." "What did you say?" "I said I needed to think about it." She looked up. "And then I asked Lily." Margaret waited. "Lily said yes," Diane said. "She said she wanted to see him. She said—" Diane stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. "She said she missed who he used to be, and she wanted to know if that person was still in there somewhere." Her voice had gone very quiet. She said it like it was the most straightforward thing in the world, like of course you go look for the good part of someone, even after they've hurt you. Margaret thought about 13 years old, about the things you understand at that age that you sometimes lose access to later. "She gets that from you," Margaret said. Diane looked at her. "She gets it from you," she said. "You showed her that." Margaret did not argue with her. She just reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own, briefly, the way she had when Diane was small and had come to her with something hard. And then she sat back and picked up her coffee cup and said, "Tell him one dinner, neutral location. You stay visible, but give them space. See what Lily says after." Diane nodded. "That's what I was thinking." "Then you already had the answer," Margaret said. "You just needed to say it out loud." The dinner happened the following Saturday. Margaret knew about it only because Diane had told her, and because Lily had texted her beforehand a single message that said, "Wish me luck, Grandma," which Margaret had answered with a row of small hearts, and then put her phone in her pocket and gone to garden until she heard back. The text from Lily came 2 hours later. It said, "It was okay." He cried again. "I didn't. I think I'm okay." Margaret read it standing in the garden with soil on her gloves, and she typed back, "I think you are too, sweetheart. I really do." She did not hear from Diane until the next morning. Diane called at 8, and her voice was measured and thoughtful. Not happy exactly, not sad, but somewhere in the territory of a person who has processed something difficult and arrived at a place they can stand on. She talked the whole drive home, Diane said. She told me everything he said. She was kind of analyzing him, actually, like she was trying to figure out which parts were real. A pause. At one point she said, "He seems smaller." I didn't know what she meant at first, and then I did. She meant the version of him she was afraid of doesn't match the actual man sitting across the table from her, Margaret said. "Yeah." Diane was quiet for a moment. She said she wants to see him again, monthly maybe, with structure, not just whenever he feels like it. "Good," Margaret said. "That's healthy. That's Lily setting her own terms." "Where did she learn that?" Diane asked, and Margaret could hear the smile under the question. "Same place you did," Margaret said. "Eventually." Diane laughed, soft and real. What happened in September was the thing Margaret would remember longest. Not because it was dramatic, there had been enough drama to last several lifetimes, but because it arrived quietly in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, and it meant everything. She was in the garden when she heard the front gate. She looked up, and it was Lily, alone, on her bicycle, with her backpack on and her hair loose, and her expression the particular expression of a teenager who has something on their mind and has decided to do something about it. "I didn't tell Mom I was coming," Lily said. "I figured," Margaret said. "Come in." Lily leaned her bike against the fence and came through the gate and stood in the garden and looked around at the roses, which were on their second bloom of the season, smaller than the spring blooms, but no less determined. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said. "Yes." "When my mom did the thing with your bank account, she said it directly, no build-up, which was also something Margaret recognized in her. She told me about it. She sat me down a few weeks ago and told me the whole thing." Lily looked at her. "She said she thought I was old enough to know and that she was ashamed of it, and that you had handled it better than she deserved." Margaret pulled off her gardening gloves. "That sounds like her." "Did it ever make you not want to be her mom anymore?" Lily asked. "Like, even for a second?" Margaret looked at her granddaughter. 14 now, just a few weeks past her birthday, standing in the garden in the late afternoon light with that direct, unguarded quality she had, that willingness to ask the real question when most adults had already learned not to. "No," Margaret said, and she meant it without qualification, not for 1 second. Lily nodded slowly. "How come?" "Because she's mine," Margaret said simply. "Whatever she does, she's mine. That doesn't mean I accept everything. It doesn't mean there aren't consequences. But it means I don't stop." She paused. "You don't stop on people who are yours, even when it's hard. Maybe especially then." Lily was quiet for a moment. She reached out and touched one of the rose blooms, very gently, just with one finger. "Is my dad yours?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "No," she said honestly. "He's not, but he's yours. And that means you get to decide what you do with that, on your own schedule, and nobody gets to take that decision away from you." Lily nodded again. She let go of the rose. She looked at her grandmother with those clear eyes that had been watching everything carefully for 14 years. "Can I help with the garden?" she said. "I have like 2 hours before Mom expects me home." "Grab a pair of gloves from the shed," Margaret said, "the small ones on the left." They worked in the garden for an hour and 40 minutes. Margaret showed her how to deadhead properly, which blooms to take and which to leave, how to read what the plant needed by the color of the leaves and the direction of the new growth. Lily listened and asked questions, and did not do it perfectly, but did it carefully, which was more important. At one point, Lily said, "You really love this garden." "I do," Margaret said. "Why roses specifically?" Margaret thought about it. "Your grandfather planted the first one," she said, "the year your mother was born. He didn't know anything about roses. He just bought one because it was on sale at the hardware store, and he thought your grandmother would like it. She smiled. He planted it in completely the wrong spot. I moved it the next spring. He was annoyed about that for about a week, and then he forgot to be annoyed because the thing was thriving. Lily grinned. He sounds like he was funny. He was, Margaret said. Mostly on accident. When Lily left, pedaling back down the street with her backpack bouncing, Margaret stood at the gate and watched her go. She stood there until Lily turned the corner and disappeared. And then she stood there a little longer. The last piece came in October, unexpected and small and complete. A card arrived in the mail, handwritten, which was rare enough to be noticeable. The return address was Bryce's name at an apartment she didn't recognize, a different one from the address Patricia had found during the proceedings. He had moved. She stood at the mailbox, and she opened it there in the October morning with the leaves beginning to turn and the air carrying the first real cold of the season. The card was plain, white, no printed sentiment on the front. Inside, he had written in his particular cramped handwriting that she had seen on birthday cards for 13 years and never paid attention to. He wrote that he knew he had no standing to ask for anything. He wrote that he had done damage that he understood could not be undone by a card or an apology or any single action. He wrote that he had been in therapy for 4 months and that he was not writing to report progress or to ask for credit, but because his therapist had asked him to name the people he had specifically wronged and to acknowledge it directly without agenda. He wrote that he had wronged Margaret specifically by allowing Diane to believe that her relationship with her mother was something to be managed rather than protected, that he had spent years subtly positioning himself between them, and that this had been deliberate and that he was sorry for it. He did not ask for a response. Margaret stood at the mailbox and read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and walked inside. She put the envelope in the drawer of her desk where she kept important papers. Not the filing cabinet, not the trash, the drawer. She was not sure yet what it meant or what she would do with it. She suspected she might never be sure. Some things did not resolve into certainty, and she had made her peace with that. She called Helen. "You sitting down?" she said. "Always," Helen said. "What happened?" Margaret told her about the card. She read parts of it aloud. Helen was quiet through all of it, and then she said, "Well, people surprise you." "Sometimes," Margaret said. "What are you going to do with it?" "Nothing right now." She looked out the window at the garden. The roses had gone dormant, the last blooms finished, the canes bare and gray against the fence. "Ask me in the spring." Helen laughed. "Fair enough." "How are you?" Margaret said. "Good," Helen said. "I made that lemon cake you like. Come over Saturday." "I'll be there," Margaret said. She hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of the house, the particular October quiet that was different from February quiet, warmer somehow even as the temperature dropped, carrying something that felt like arrival rather than absence. She thought about February, about the cold coffee and the bare roses, and her daughter's voice on the phone saying, "You're just going to waste it sitting in that house doing nothing." She had not wasted it. She had never wasted it. She'd been building something, quietly and steadily, the way she had always built things, the way the roses came back every year, the way certain people hold on through the winters and return, rooted in something that the cold could not reach. She was 67 years old with 2 bad knees and 1 good eye, and a garden that bloomed every April, and a daughter who was learning to stand on her own, and a granddaughter who asked the real questions, and a son who showed up with champagne without being asked, and a journal full of things that had happened and been survived. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. She stood up, she went to the kitchen, she made coffee, and she sat down at the table with it while it was still hot, and she drank it and looked out the window at the bare gray rose canes, and she waited for spring.